Good evening. It's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce you to Dr. Carlson. Like many in the audience, I've read his work for many years, and it's been influential in my studies of the family. But I had the wonderful opportunity almost exactly a year to this time. He and I were a part of a Family Trends Summit that gathered in Switzerland last year, and it was a one-of-a-kind venue, a beautiful place to be, but for me, by far, one of the greatest highlights was to be able to spend time with Dr. Carlson, and so I'm delighted that you'll have the opportunity to hear from him in person tonight. Dr. Allan C. Carlson is a scholar and distinguished visiting professor of history at Hillsdale College in Michigan. He retired as the president of the Howard Center in 2015. In this capacity, he directed the Family in America Studies Center, served as the international secretary of the World Congress of Families, and edited the Family in America newsletter. He's also a former president of the Rockford Institute. He previously taught at Gettysburg College and Oral College. His research and writings have addressed the underlying causes of population decline, the effects of taxation and regulation on the size and well-being of the family, the negative effects of feminism on women's roles in society, as well as historical efforts to implement a family wage in the United States. He's written over 13 books, including The Natural Family, The Family in America, Third Ways and Family Cycles, Strength, Decline, and Renewal in the American Domestic Life, 1630 to 2000. In addition to his books, he's contributed over 50 additional volumes on issues of family, education, religion, and population. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan appointed him to the Special National Commission on Children, a post that he served with until 1993. Dr. Carlson founded the World Congress on Families in 1997, which held its 11th major international session convened in Budapest, Hungary, in May of 2017. On a personal note, he is married to Betsy Carlson. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren, 4 of which were born in 2016, which Dr. Carlson and his wife refer to as the year of the babies. I give you Dr. Carlson.
Well, that was most generous. The title of my talk tonight is The Natural Family in Peril, Past and Present, and the Hopeful Future. But I have a less dramatic subtitle. If I'd used it, no one would show up. But my less dramatic subtitle is A Meditation on History and the Making of Family Policy. This past summer, I attended my 50th high school class reunion in my hometown, Des Moines, Iowa. A near classmate of mine at Theodore Roosevelt High School was Bill Bryson, who went on to become a best-selling author of volumes such as A Walk in the Woods and A Short History of Nearly Everything. Among these books is also The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid, a memoir of growing up in Des Moines during the 1950s and early 1960s. His early chapters delightfully relate my own experience as well. One of these chapters he entitles, Welcome to Kid World. Bryson writes, the most striking difference between then and now was how many kids there were then. America had 30 million children aged 12 or under in the mid-1950s, and 4 million new babies were plopping onto the changing mats every year. So there were kids everywhere, all the time in densities now unimaginable. We, he and I and our classmates, were the children of the famed baby boom, a remarkable and unexpected episode in family formation that occurred during the 2 decades after World War II. Not far in the background were our mothers, most then happily self-labeled as homemakers. Bryson recalls a contemporaneous article in Harper's Magazine by one Nancy B. Mavity, condemning the two-income family, where both husband and wife worked outside the house to support a more ambitious lifestyle. "I'd be ashamed to let my wife work," one man told Ms. Mavity, and her tone showed that she expected most of her readers to agree. Who were these curious historical figures, the full-time homemakers of the happy days of the 1950s? At one level, they were the product of choices made en masse by women during and after World War II. At another and deeper and not well understood level, they were a new manifestation, a new example of a solution to a deep social problem caused by that massive, unprecedented historical event we label the Industrial Revolution. Regarding that first level, a fine resource here is the book Homeward Bound, American Families in the Cold War Era, authored by University of Minnesota historian Elaine Tyler May. She notes that almost every observer and journalist active in the early 1940s expected in the near future radical changes in gender roles and home life, a consequence of the massive disruptions brought on by American involvement in a new global war. Recall the now iconic Rosie the Riveter illustration. And yet, to everyone's surprise, and I quote Professor May here, the roles of breadwinner husband and homemaker wife were not abandoned, they were embraced. Professor May writes as a self-described feminist. Nonetheless, she admits that this broad turn by young women toward domesticity was not forced on them by some group of patriarchs. Rather, it came from the demand of the women themselves. A few specifics that she supplies. One old-line feminist complained that her sociologist husband could no longer find a senior female student wanting to prepare for graduate school. Nice girls, smart girls, girls able to do fairly complex statistical work and think clearly, all going to be married right after graduation and all wanting at least 4 children. Home economics programs proliferated. The home ec major became the leading choice for female undergraduates. The women's colleges of the East Coast, Vassar, Smith, and so on, recently proud of producing independent women, now claim success because a high proportion of our graduates marry successfully. The 300 couples who participated in the Kelly longitudinal study, a remarkable 25-year-long annual survey of attitudes towards marriage, family, and sexuality by men and women reaching adulthood in the 1940s, overwhelmingly expressed a fervent commitment to marriage. Asked if they had sacrificed anything by marrying and raising children, the vast majority of the KLS women replied, nothing. Asked if they had regrets over becoming homemakers, the great majority again said no. Quote, they gained rather than lost in the bargain. The KLS men also overwhelmingly reported being happy, delighted in having given up what one called the boredom and futility of bachelorhood. As Professor May ably summarizes, the young women of the day, well, I got a little goofed up, would not be dissuaded. They were homeward bound. These homemakers of the 1950s also were a new form of an old solution to a great social and economic problem. It arose as the family-centered economy, the economy that had defined human life for thousands of years, gave way to the industrial order, which in 1945 was not even yet 150 years old. Prior to 1800, in Europe, in North America, the vast majority of people everywhere lived within a family-centered economy, notable for its high degree of self-sufficiency. Whether on a peasant or family farm, in an artisan's shop, in the town, in a nomad's tent, or in a fisherman's cottage by the sea, people lived and worked in the same place. That was the human way of existence. Even in villages and towns, they grew their own vegetables. Gardens were everywhere. They raised and processed their own meat, particularly chicken and pork. They wove their own cloth, they sewed their own garments, and commonly built their own furniture and shelters, or homes. They educated their own children and cared for their own elderly. A division of labor existed. There were coopers and wheelwrights and finished carpenters, but most households held to a fairly high degree of self-sufficiency, exemplified in young America by the sturdy yeoman farmers of Jeffersonian lore. And in fact, it was more than lore. They really did exist. Within such homes, there was a natural complementarity. Man, woman, and older children all worked toward the success of the small family enterprise, conditioned by their relative strengths, skills, and maturity. This was the natural family in its pristine form. The Industrial Revolution tore through this world. Its benefits were clear. More standardized goods at a cheaper price, a rising average level of consumption. Relative to the family, though, these gains came at a price. First, the industrial process, which relied on centralized factories using machines driven by power sources such as water and steam, severed the bond between home and work, a profound revolution in human affairs. Economic historian Karl Polanyi calls it the Great Transformation. For those entering the industrial order, they would now work in one place and sleep in another, something quite new. Second, the industrial process meant that the home surrendered an ever-growing number of functions. This began with the spinning of yarn and the weaving of cloth. It eventually spread to every family function. The growth and preparation of food, the making of furniture and shelter, the education of children through common or state schools, resting on industrial models which spread alongside the new economy, and even, eventually, the care of the elderly, the rise of the nursing home. By 1930, writing in an official government report, one prominent social scientist simply concluded that the factory has displaced the family. American homes were, and I quote again, merely parking places for parents and children who spend their active hours elsewhere. And he thought this to be an inevitable and good thing. Third, the incentives of an industrial capitalist economy drove firms to find labor wherever they could, and in a competitive environment at the cheapest possible price. Factories would hire men, women, or children. Given the respective tasks involved, it had no compelling reason to worry about the consequences for family life. With work hours in the early decades of industrialization, normally running 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, family life was profoundly affected. Father in one factory, mother in another, the older children in still others. Completely left out of the equation was the fate of infants and young children. Who should or could care for them? Leaders of the industrial sector, or at least most of them, were indifferent. The workers themselves, though, were not, nor were religious reformers who witnessed the devastating effects of the new economy on home life. As marriage rates and fertility rates tumbled, and as the number of abandoned or unsupervised children swelled. One strategy eventually adopted was to find a way to limit the incursion of industrialism into the home. The method chosen was clear. The industrial sector could have one, but only one family member, and this would normally be the father. as a labor movement pamphlet from Philadelphia in 1835 declared, "Oppose the employment of women with all your might and with all your strength, for it will prove our ruin." We must strive to obtain sufficient remuneration for our labor, to keep the wives and daughters and sisters of our people at home. That cormorant capital will have every man, woman, and child to toil, but let us exert our families to oppose its designs. On a much more positive note, although confronting the very same social problem, Sarah Hale, editor of the hugely influential magazine Godey's Ladies' Book, had the largest circulation of any American periodical in the 1860s and 70s. She argued that if the work of women could be left uncorrupted by the acquisitive market mindset and rest instead on love, then American culture might retain its contact with virtue and goodness. Hale also summoned what she called the Eden laws in support of distinct callings for men and women. God's creation of human marriage, his command to be fruitful and multiply, his creation of sexual complementarity. As she put it, man is the worker and provider, the protector and the lawgiver. Woman is the preserver, the teacher, and exemplar. Such ideas underlay the regime of the family wage. In it, fathers served as breadwinners and should receive in turn wages adequate to support themselves, their wives, and their children. Women served as homemakers, devoting themselves full-time to the care of homes and children. In this way, both the gifts of industrialization and family life could be enjoyed. Excuse me just a second here. This system required, however, that citizens accept fairly sharp limits on equality, specifically in the economic realm. In the 19th century, most Americans, it appears, readily did so. As early as 1831, the famed French visitor Alexis de Tocqueville, subsequent author of the classic work Democracy in America, reported with astonishment how Americans, unlike Europeans, took constant care to trace two clearly distinct lines of action for the two sexes. Young women, he said, taught beforehand what to expect, voluntarily and freely entered into matrimony, fully aware that they would now live within the narrow circle of domestic interests and duties. This led Tocqueville to conclude that the most important cause of the Americans' singular prosperity and growing strength was the superiority of their women. To be sure, there were some dissenters, notably the women who gathered at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, demanding free admission of their sex into the professions and a broader economic emancipation. 50 years later, in her 1898 book, Women and Economics, Charlotte Perkins Gilman attacked what she called the overdevelopment of the sex distinction. Those homes with full-time homemakers and mothers were actually primitive entities, she said, a clumsy tangle of rudimentary industries that violated the modern laws of economics. She added, a family unity which is only bound together with the tablecloth is of questionable value. Her alternative was clear as well. Complete the full industrialization of home life. Eliminate what she called the clumsy amateur known as the homemaker. Turn cooking, childcare, elder care, and cleaning into businesses, services to be purchased like all others. Gilman described, again in 1898, a future with child daycare centers and fast food restaurants. She actually invented them. Regarding the latter, she outlined a process where people would drive their horses and buggies up to a window and received their hot food in a bag. Let each young woman, like each man, find her place in a specialized job or profession. Under Gilman's vision, the home would no longer be a workshop or a museum. Rather, it would become, she said, the place of peace and rest, of love and privacy among economic equals. Well, what happened during the 1940s was a retreat from the world desired by Charlotte Perkins Gilman and a return to the world sought by Sarah Hale, albeit in a more secular form. The results were real. Between 1932 and 1946, the marriage rate rose by 40%. The average age of first marriage fell to 22.5 for men and 20 for women. That is, half of marriages were 20 or below. These were near record low numbers. Fertility soared. The baby boom, climbing by 70% between 1940 and 1957. This rise in childbearing was especially concentrated among the better educated. The average completed family size of women who had attended college more than doubled. Even the divorce rate stabilized. Small home economies rebounded as well. An honest accounting of unpaid work performed in the home showed that its value in 1960 was nearly equal to that of the official economy, with the virtue that it was untaxed. The family wage also returned in modified form. The one-income breadwinner homemaker family again became the norm, the expected way of life, and enjoyed popular support. As late as 1970, 80% of young married women believed that it was better for wives to be homemakers and husbands breadwinners, as the labor market became sorted into men's jobs and women's jobs. Public policy rallied behind this system. For example, Congress created the homemaker's pension under Social Security. Congress also reformed taxes to favor households with a full-time homemaker and a mother, a technique called income splitting. On a personal note, my own mother, to her dying day at age 85, 6 years ago, was happy and proud that she had been a mother and a homemaker of this sort, and she certainly was not alone. Yet this family system, as a normative entity, did not last. It began to unravel in the late 1960s and effectively collapsed in most places during the next decade. Many factors contributed to this, but the dominant one, in my opinion, was the powerful pull of the equality principle. As Tocqueville wrote, again back in the 1830s, democratic nations are at all times fond of equality, but there are certain epochs at which the passion they entertain for it swells to the height of fury. At such times, the quest for equality becomes, in his words, ardent, insatiable, insensate, invincible. Nothing can stand in its way. Most clearly focused in the new feminism launched by Betty Friedan, the cry for economic equality quickly swept away, in most places, the cultural attitudes, laws, and regulations that had sustained the family system of the post-war era. The homemaker, recently celebrated, was culturally abandoned. Home economics programs in most places withered or had to find a new purpose. The family wage was repudiated as an affront to the equality principle. Most young women now marched into the labor force. Among those who did marry, the two-income family tended to become the new normal. In retrospect, a heavy price was paid. One fascinating account published in 2003 comes from Elizabeth Warren. Yes, the very woman who currently serves as the very progressive Democratic senator from Massachusetts. Entitled "The Two-Income Trap," Why Middle-Class Fathers and Mothers Are Going Broke, and co-authored with her daughter, Amelia Warren Tyagi. The book includes such statements as, the willingness of American families to send 20 million mothers into the workforce had unintended fallout. Married couples with children are now almost twice as likely to file for bankruptcy as their childless counterparts. When mothers joined the workforce, the family gave up something of considerable, although unrecognized, economic value. An extra skilled and dedicated adult, available to pitch in to help save the family during times of emergency. Both sides of the political spectrum discounted the financial value of the stay-at-home mother. By the 1990s, a working wife was 40% more likely to divorce than her stay-at-home counterpart. And by foregoing childbearing, a woman decreases her chances of going bankrupt by 66%. Once again, the fate of children in the egalitarian industrial order came to the fore. The easiest solution, as true 150 years earlier, was once again, don't have children. This was and remains, in my opinion, the most glaring of the cultural contradictions of industrial capitalism. As economist Ulrich Beck explains in his book, Risk Society Towards a New Modernity, the modern labor market insists on mobility with scant regard for personal situations. The opposite is true for marriage and the rearing of children. He continues, thought through to its ultimate consequence, the market model of modernity implies a society without families and children. Everyone must be independent, free for the demands of the market in order to guarantee his, her economic existence. More personally, this story reveals an arena for debates over culture and public policy that continues to fascinate me. These disputes over how to shelter natural family life and children from the negative effects of industrialization remain critical to any national future. These quarrels are also, dare I say, ones in which I feel comfortable, where I understand and appreciate the arguments on all sides, and enjoy engaging in debates where the ground rules and many shared assumptions are clear. Being more specific, I share in Elizabeth Warren's analysis of the woes brought on by the two-income trap. I also share her opinion that we cannot simply return as a nation back to the family model of the 1950s. Such a system, which clearly rested on forms of inequality, can work only if supported by the overwhelming majority of women and men. That support does not now exist. We also agree on the importance of strong marriages and fruitful families to the national future. Children are our most important treasure. A system, economic, political, and social and cultural, that intentionally or otherwise punishes those who rear children must be reformed. How then should we respond? Well, this is the question that pulled me into the study of family policy 45 years ago. It began with my doctoral dissertation, which critically examined how the democratic socialists of Sweden constructed a family policy in the 1930s. It was published as The Swedish Experiment in Family Politics. Then, in order to raise both the marriage and birth rates in Sweden, the Social Democratic Party created a child-centered welfare state, where the aspiration was that all the costs and many of the direct tasks of raising children would be picked up by the government. At the same time, in Catholic lands such as Belgium and France, again in the 1930s, industrial leaders and politicians created fairly elaborate systems of child allowances, pay supplements for fathers calculated by the number of their children. In our time and place, the misfit of the child-centered family in the industrial order has returned again. Elizabeth Warren's list of policy responses in her book resembles those adopted in Sweden 80 years ago. She supports publicly funded daycare and preschools for all, an expanded universal comprehensive disability insurance program to cover pregnancies, an end to what she calls predatory lending and housing, publicly financed paid parental leave, universal single-payer health insurance for all families with children, and so on. I have favored different forms of public policy as a substitute for the old family wage regime. Models involving much less direct intrusion by the state into the family, and models which actually, I think, expand rather than restrict choices. First, I have argued for the adjustment of federal and state tax codes to allow families rearing children to keep substantially more of the earned income that they have. And second, I have urged alteration of Social Security old age pensions to reward parents who bear larger families. Starting in the mid-1960s, I began to write essays and books urging the creation of a new child tax credit, initially at the $1,000 level. This would supplement the existing personal tax exemption for children, allowing taxpayers with offspring to write off $1,000 of federal tax owed per dependent child. As Jason mentioned in introducing me, in 1988, President Reagan appointed me to a special National Commission on Children. Two-thirds of its members were Democrats, including such notables as Senator J. Rockefeller of West Virginia, who became our commission chairman, then Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas, and child advocate Marian Wright Edelman, the mentor to Hillary Clinton, along with the leaders of the National Education Association and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the two largest public sector unions in the country. I made it my mission on the commission to see that a new universal refundable tax credit of $1,000 per child would become the commission's principal recommendation. And so it happened, not just exclusively because of me, but I think I was a part of the reason it did happen. On a unanimous bipartisan vote, as reported here in the Commission's 1991 final report. 5 years later, in 1996, a bipartisan tax reform bill created the child tax credit, initially at $500. It excluded both refundability for low-income taxpayers and availability to higher-income families as well, so it was far from perfect. However, in 2001, a new tax bill raised that number to $1,000 per child. And just a few months ago, late 2017, the new Republican tax plan adopted by Congress doubled that figure to $2,000, introduced a partial scheme of refundability, and extended availability to all but the very richest of households, something very close to what our commission had recommended back in 1991. So that part of the tax bill pleased me very much. I've also been arguing for decades that old age pensions under Social Security should be adjusted to give a higher stipend to those retired parents who raised children. The greater the number of your offspring, the higher your Social Security check. In a pay-as-you-go Social Security system, it's children we need as future workers, not so much the contributions. Here, though, I can claim no success, at least not yet. Will this new $2,000 per child tax credit bring a renaissance in American family life? Will marriage rates and birth rates in the United States now at historic lows, soar once again? Alas, while this measure is, I believe, a meaningful response to the problems facing families in an industrialized order, it is not sufficient to bring on a revolution. Moreover, the family issue has since moved into other and much more disorienting arenas, namely the politics of sex and gender. These have complicated the family debate, and it is to these matters that I now briefly turn, attempting to sort out the situation in an understandable way. One way that I have found useful to see shifts in intellectual fashion and cultural fashion regarding the family is to compare successive editions of family sociology textbooks and related volumes. Here you have the same publisher, the same author, the same broad subject matters. However, curious changes often emerge. For example, Gerald Leslie's popular 1967 volume, The Family in Social Context, describes the middle-class, breadwinner, homemaker, child-focused family as an ideal being achieved by an increasing proportion of the population, including ethnic minorities. However, his 1976 edition, published only 9 years later, tosses out these values completely. It stresses instead a family system resting on the priority of sexual equality, particularly in economic matters, free sexual experimentation, and easy access to divorce. Here we see, I think, a curious form of evidence for the social changes I described a little while ago. This means of measuring change is also true, I found, when comparing two official histories of the sexual revolution in the 20th century America. Coming from the same source, Playboy magazine. The 1973 version, entitled Rape of the Ape, ape being the American Puritan ethic, APE, describes in brutally frank language how a group of men, described as, quote, dirty-minded beyond belief, set out, and I quote again, to defile the world's most antiseptic culture and corrupt the world's most respectable citizenry, us. Subtitled The Obscening of America, the book continues. Wherever there was a strawberry church social, they would search and destroy. They would storm every bastion of decency, besmirch and defile the enemy on the beaches, in the homes, and in the streets. They would recruit allies among the corrupt and despoil the innocent. They would give smut respectability by dressing it up in the dignified cloak of science. They would shock and shock again. And the result, everything got devalued. Not just the dollar, but everything in American life. Virginity, love, God, motherhood, mom's apple pie. General Motors has less value now, and so does the Bill of Rights. The quality of men available to lead was devalued. Our technology was devalued. Our institutions and our customs were devalued. The worth of an individual was devalued. All of the pleasures were devalued. Again, these judgments, without qualifications, come straight from the Playboy Press, 1973. In 1999, though, Playboy magazine brought out a new Playboy's History of the Sexual Revolution. Absent now was the cynical honesty of the earlier version. In its place was a celebration of the sexual revolution as the crowning achievement of human liberty. As editor Hugh Hefner himself wrote in the new foreword, I believe that sex is the primary motivating factor in the course of human history, and in the 20th century it has emerged from the taboos and controversy that has surrounded it through the ages to claim its rightful place in society. This was the century of sex, when mankind confronted the fears that controlled and shaped sex as they had since the beginning of time, and triumphed. I'll leave you to decide which is more accurate. Following this transition of unbridled sexuality from vice and destruction, first edition, into liberation and a near spiritual achievement, second edition, came a new theory of gender. It drew on the idea of a fully liberated sexuality, yet had other deeper sources as well. And again, I'm looking at it here as an intellectual movement. First, liberalism itself. Latent within the liberal idea, the idea first shaped by Hobbes and Locke, was the prospect of individual self-development. As T.H. Green explained about a century ago, the institutions of civic life could and should render it possible for a man to be freely determined by the idea of a possible satisfaction of himself. Freely determined by the idea of a possible satisfaction of himself. Put another way, to be truly free, each individual must shed the tangle of customs, duties, and institutions imposed by history, place, and birth, and find his or her own path. True liberty came through such self-actualization. The second idea strand, Nietzscheanism. The late 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche ruthlessly skewered the Judeo-Christian ethic of love, duty, responsibility, and restraint. In its place, he elevated the Übermensch, the Superman, who created his or her own morality. The truly successful Superman was one who then imposed this self-created morality on others. And the third strand, Gnosticism. The Gnostic idea is thousands of years old and has taken many, many forms. Common to all, though, has been the elevation of the human spirit or mind and the demotion or denigration of the human body. For the Gnostic, the human body constrains, restricts. It holds the mind or spirit in bondage. For the Gnostic, there is no natural order, no natural law grounded in biology and other material forms. Self-discovery and enlightenment comes as an individual gains liberation from the chains of nature. Among all Gnostics, procreation, the birth of children, is at best irrelevant and usually deplored. These ideas have come together under the banner of gender theory. At its core, it offers a radically different concept of human telos, of human purpose or destiny, relative to sexuality and family. The historic Christian or Judeo-Christian understanding is that each person is born male or female, yet as such is incomplete. Each man and woman at an appropriate age and in appropriate ways then seeks to become complete by finding a mate of the opposite sex. Bonded through marriage, they become one flesh, a completed being, now ready and able to procreate, to bring new human life into the world. Every religious, cultural, economic, and political institution exists in important ways to encourage and support that quest and end. Under gender theory, or sometimes called LGBTQ theory, each person is born sexually ambiguous. While the person's body will have distinctive plumbing, that is no indication of true gender, for gender is free of bodily constraints. The individual's quest, beginning as a child is to find which gender from an ever-growing list, Facebook recently had it at 56, which gender they are. One reliable way of doing this is to try them all. If, after finding your gender, your physical biology is wrong, corrective surgery can follow. The procreation of children is at best tangential to this process. For LGBTQ advocates, every religious, cultural, economic, and political institution should encourage and support this quest. Today, our culture war, once defined by the abortion issue, increasingly focuses on these differences over sexuality and gender. The family policy matters of most interest to me, which I described earlier, measures to protect the procreative natural family within an industrialized environment. These now have, I must admit, a somewhat antique quality about them. The storm and fury are elsewhere. A most compelling question arises. Can these rival worldviews, these competing visions of human telos or purpose, coexist in relative peace? To answer that, let's examine the question over a very specific issue. What constitutes child abuse? For the LGBTQ activist, child abuse can be understood as any action taken by any person, including biological parents and religious leaders, which prevents a child from launching and conducting its quest for gender self-discovery. For the Judeo-Christian, meanwhile, corrective gender surgery on a child will probably be seen as an extreme act of child abuse. I perceive little middle ground here. Might these radically different visions of human identity and purpose find a tolerable harmony in a renewed understanding of the United States as a vast federation of small communities, each allowed to govern itself on such matters? Might American law and public education gain the flexibility to allow gender-sensitive parents to raise their own children their way, while traditional Christian, Jewish, and Muslim parents raise their children their way? Might religious liberty, as guaranteed by the First Amendment to the Constitution, might it provide adequate protections for such rival understandings of human nature and human purpose? Might parental rights, battered in recent decades over issues such as a young person's access to contraceptives, might parental rights gain more legal respect? In the short run, other than noting the considerable practical difficulties facing any of these accommodations, I can offer no firm answers. Only to say that for the sake of order and peace, I hope so. Certainly, answers to such questions will help define what family policy making will mean in the immediate years ahead. In the long run, however, I believe that this great and contentious divide will disappear, despite whatever actions judges, politicians, and cultural leaders now take. It will disappear from the sheer weight of reality. To borrow a phrase from an old television commercial, you can't fool Mother Nature, at least not for long. All idea systems that violate nature and nature's laws eventually fail and disappear, sometimes after a spell of violence, sometimes quite peacefully and quietly. An example of the violent form in the 20th century was the communist project in Russia to shape new Soviet man. After intermittent efforts by the communists to destroy the natural family, and after an orgy of bloodletting and intentional campaigns of starvation, with particular effect on infants, communism finally and simply fell apart. In the end, no one believed in it anymore. At the quiet end of change, ideas systems that abandon the realities of human biology, such as found among the Gnostics of the second Christian century, or among the religious community known as the Shakers, closer to our time. They also have disappeared. Here even, Charles Darwin is helpful. Any attempt at a way of life grounded in indifference or hostility toward infant life is an evolutionary dead end, his words. No offspring, no future. A recent restatement of this came from British political scientist Eric Kaufmann in his 2012 book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? A self-described secular liberal, Kaufmann nonetheless argues that religious fundamentalists are on course to take over the world through demography. Now, by fundamentalists, he means any religious group within which scriptural teachings on marriage and procreation, on having children, do influence the behavior of adherents, including their economic choices. He surveys religious communities around the globe with above replacement fertility. That is, each generation is still growing, including Anabaptists such as the Hutterites and the Old Order Amish, ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews, Salafi Islamists, the Islamists you don't hear too much about. They're too busy having children. Quiverful Protestants, Laestadian Lutherans in the Finnish North Woods, and yes, he has a chapter on the Mormons in the American West. Already, such groups are expanding their relative share of some national populations. If compounded over several more generations, the results become stunning. Kaufmann concludes, again, these are the closing sentences of his book, it will be a century or more before the world completes its demographic transition. There is still too much smoke in the air for us to pick out the peaks and valleys of the emerging social order. This much seems certain. Without a new secular liberal ideology to inspire social cohesion, fundamentalism cannot be stopped. The religious shall inherit the earth. Although coming from a surprising source, this conclusion may offer hope to those who see the natural family and new life, children, as vital to the human future. I apologize for this picture. I own the rights to it. It's the 4 grandchildren born in 2016. So I thank you. Questions, please.
Please use the microphone. Maybe you left no room for questions.
Oh, just one here. Oh, yeah.
Turn it on. The switch.
How about now? Better? Couple questions on the tax policy. It's, it can be controversial if you try to use tax policy or whatever type of policy to alter, certain types of choices that parents make. And I'm wondering, I don't know the details as well as you do, but from what I understand, it seems that educated people tend to have fewer children than less educated. But also the political dimension that liberals, particularly single white females living in cities, are one of the highest demographic for the Democratic Party, and that white religious married women are one of the highest demographics for the Republican Party. So I'm wondering, on that kind of aspect, does education matter at all? Does it matter who we're trying to target? Do we just want to, are you advocating just a blanket increase in the number of children being had, or do you want to target people with PhDs or people that are blue collar? Does that matter at all, given that it's so controversial? And then in terms of kind of what Kaufman is saying, if liberalism is causing all these problems, does it eventually just, dissipate itself? Basically, the females or the liberals living in cities, basically they just don't have grandchildren, therefore Iowa just keeps moving in and replacing that, or interested to hear what you say about that.
Well, in terms of tax policy, you're right, there's controversies around that. The Wall Street Journal almost relentlessly denounces the child tax credit. I keep a file on this, and about 4 times a year they run an editorial denouncing the child tax credit as social engineering. Of course, they rarely have met a tax break for corporations that they don't love, but somehow giving it to families with children is an affront to all that's good and dear. They're just wrong on that. But more generally, how should we construct a policy like that? Should we favor the more intelligent? Should we favor a certain group? In a democracy, we can't do that. I mean, and that's why I think the idea of the refundable tax credit I think is a great idea. If it's refundable, it goes to everybody that's raising a child, married, single, working, non-working. The refundability part should replace other aspects of welfare benefits. It becomes a little bit of a guaranteed minimum income for somebody raising children. It helps at the bottom level. But it exists at the top, should exist at the top level too. I think, again, a universal credit like that is an act of democracy, but it's also a recognition of the problem I tried to explain early on. Children don't fit well into a market-oriented economy. They're kind of the forgotten figures in it because they're not productive. But in the long run, children are the future. What's the point of having a commonwealth if we're just all sitting around waiting for each other to die? And last one, turn out the lights, please. What kind of a country is that? I mean, we're here to have children. we're here to create families and to grow and to prosper and to do good deeds and to do good things. So I don't see any inconsistency in it. No, actually, relative to the Kaufman as a commentary, to some degree, I think that will happen or could happen, that those who don't have children will disappear. The trick, though, is this, is that there are different ways to gain children. And what if you set up a system where religious people have children, but another group with a different ideology manages to gain control of the school system and teach the children a different set of values from those that their parents have? I'm not going to name names here, but I think you get the drift. You can, in a sense, take children away. And I think that's not beyond the realm of possibility. That may be where the real contest lies. Will religious people be able to maintain control over the education and rearing of their children?
But on the financial question, then, is it just a matter, I guess what I'm saying is, are there any other means to get to those groups? I think they used to call them in the 80s the dinks, double income, no kids, right? So they've got PhDs, they've got MBAs, went to Harvard, and they just don't have children like other groups do. It seems that a tax cut for people that are making $4 million or whatever, it's just not going to pull on them. Are there any other ways, countries like Germany, Japan, that aren't seeing children born in this way? Is there a way to target these groups besides just the carrot of financial incentive?
Well, they have to have some other value system has to come into their lives. And I'm talking generally that's going to be a religious value system of one form or another.
Values, okay.
Particularly the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all place an emphasis on the procreative family in different ways to some degree, but it's all there. So no, I don't think the answer is no. The Japanese are desperate to get children right now, and they're not getting many. Japan is a dying country. The Germans have tried many different things, and none of it seems to work very well. Again, well below replacement level fertility. So there's no secular incentive that the government can come up with to do it that's been successful. So I think the tax credit is the thing that I think works pretty well. Any other questions?
I guess just going right along with that same vein, we look at Germany, Japan, Russia, some of these other nations that already have quite large financial incentives for people to have families. And we notice that it's not working. And with the tax credit here in the United States, I can see how it will definitely benefit those who have families. But do you think it has potential to influence more people to have families?
I think it'll help, particularly if, say, let's take a family of 4 children, which is by American standards, but historically not large. A family at a middle income level, able, after they've calculated their federal tax owed, then take 4 times 2, 2,000 times 4, that's $8,000. Let's say they owe $10,000 in tax, suddenly they got $2,000. Yeah, that's pretty good. That will, I think, should have at least some incentive effect. But even if it doesn't have an incentive effect, I think it's the least public policy can do to remove the disincentives, some of the disincentives that exist in the nature of the system. So, and with that said, there's some countries that are, where there's some experiments taking place that are pretty interesting. The country of Hungary right now. Hungary has a government under Viktor Orban that is decidedly and strongly Christian, deeply committed to trying to find ways to help renew and support Hungarian families, strongly committed to trying to raise the birth rate, intensely committed to strengthening marriage, and they're trying some novel ideas, I think some of which it's going to take a little bit of time to see if they have effect, but they've implemented some very impressive tax policies. I have another proposal I didn't mention in my thing. How many out there have, probably here at Brigham Young, you don't have student loans, that's not a problem. But some of you, if you're at any other school in the country today, you have student loans, student loan debt, and sometimes it's pretty high. I have proposed that, this may be an answer to the first question, these would be college-educated people with heavy student debts, that they be, each parent with a student debt would be paid, have $5,000 of their debt forgiven, the principal for each child being born. And actually, the Hungarians have implemented a policy like that. And so if you owe $50,000, you could cut it in half with 5 children. And actually, that would support and encourage, I guess, probably the better educated, or at least the ones that go to college. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
But again, watch Hungary. Hungary's an interesting place right now, and I think some fascinating things are going on there. And they're trying to escape the rut of secularity, which is, I think, kind of dragging most of Europe down right now. Any others? Oh, here she is. Okay.
I was just curious, I've never heard the theory kind of liberals in a way dying off, and was curious to know what their perspective is on that. Obviously, with lower birth rates, what do they foresee for their future? What is their proposed solution?
Well, that's a good question. And I guess it's a question, who are the liberals in this case? I mean, one answer is that you don't have to raise your own children, you can import other people's children. they say through an easy immigration policy. And to some degree, maybe that's what some liberals would say. Well, let's not worry about having children. We'll just import children from other places. And that'll solve our future labor needs, and they'll be happy to be taxed to support our Social Security system and so on. That's one answer that some, I think, either intentionally or at least by indirection would say. Don't worry about it. There's plenty of kids in Latin America or Africa. We'll just import them. That's what I think one answer that they might have. When I say I want to be, I'm not denouncing everything about liberalism. I mean, in some ways we live in a liberal system, and there's some virtues to liberalism. The focus, particularly in its early form of helping to break individuals free from constraints. I mean, if liberalism had never happened, I know exactly what I would be doing today. I'd be a fairly poor peasant in a backwater part of Sweden, slopping hogs or something like that. Liberalism did open up the opportunity for change and advance of a certain very real kind. The problem is that within it are negatives that have to be kept under control by other mechanisms and other ways. Generally, religion has been the key factor in that. But also implicit to liberalism is a desire to be free of religious sentiments. Again, it's seen as something that constrains the individual. And once that balance starts to break down, that's when liberalism starts to fail and has real problems. Any other questions?
I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity and just ask you to comment on what I have understood to be a social trend. Some have been pointed out that there's a certain class of people who should preach what they practice, that is, marriage rates and even family stability is higher among the educated elite. And it's the lower classes that are suffering from family breakup, births outside of marriage and so forth. So the ones that are more willing to criticize marriage and family are the ones, in fact, practicing it and benefiting from it. Can you just talk about that trend a little?
Well, it's a very good point, and I'll try to restate it. The irony is that there are many just huge benefits to being married in terms of health, happiness, wealth creation, success. The people who need it most are those, we'll say, at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And they used to be part of that system. The family wage system I described, which took various forms at different times, but it really, for example, it succeeded brilliantly in the 20th century in lifting blue-collar men out of, I guess you'd say, sort of the working class into the middle class or the lower middle class. Part of the problem today, and I'll be quite brutally frank, when the family wage system crumbled, when it was no longer seen as right and just that men should be paid more than women, when equal pay laws began to be heavily enforced, people at the upper end, the college, at the highest level, at the professional level, among professors, still get married. They can handle the new level of equality. It's just not working out at the blue-collar level. It's particularly not working out, let's say, among African-American communities. Men are most of the men there are not seen as good marriage partners. So the women don't get married. They tend to have a child or two because they want to have a baby. But it is broken down completely. The family wage system is broken down completely, and one of the casualties has been people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And there's no amount of government programming that's going to restore that unless you do something like Senator Moynihan proposed in 1965 when this problem was first seen. The Moynihan Report, Labor Department of the United States, working for Lyndon Johnson, the future Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote The Negro American Family, A Case for National Action. We are starting to see, again, a decline in the number of African-American births inside of marriage. The number outside of marriage was up to 25%. It come up from about 10% to 25% fairly quickly. Of course, today it's close to 80%. But back then, that was seen as a crisis. What was his solution? Well, actually, it was one addressed at the problem. We need to get better job opportunities for black men to become family leaders and breadwinners. And his proposal was to, kind of how quaint things were back then, it was to double the number of days you had your mail delivered. So you'd double the number of postal employees. So you could have your mail delivered in the morning and be delivered in the afternoon. And you'd have two different, it was kind of a make-work project, but the idea was to put men to work so they become fathers and responsible homemakers, and responsible fathers and breadwinners. Until some alternative is found, and I don't know what it would be, you're going to have this problem. Is going to be, I think, a perennial one. And it is ironic because the liberal people who will denounce just about everything I just said, themselves enjoy all the benefits of marriage, and they're numerous and they're huge, and they're real, and the people they claim to be wanting to help are the ones who are being hurt by the breakdown of the marriage system of the 1950s. Okay, well, thank you very much.